We come now to item 33. Members will need notice paper 7 for this item, the Loyal Address. I call on the Archbishop of Canterbury to speak to item 33. You have up to 10 minutes.
Justin Welby, Canterbury 1. I know that in what I'm going to say today that I speak not on behalf of myself alone, but in general on behalf of Paddington Bear. Who condescended to send me his thoughts on the current situation. I'll resist the urge to say what came to my mind on his current situation. The Queen was last here in the Synod, not in York, but in London, in 2015 for the opening of the Synod in that year. It was an extraordinary occasion. She spoke superbly on the basis of a speech that had been given to her, but which she adapted freely. And for those who remember, as always with her, with exquisite comic timing. She ended the speech, and the mood of the Synod was seen in everyone getting to their feet and calling out, "God save the Queen. Long live the Queen." And as we went out and down the corridor, she said, "Archbishop, I think I've lived long enough, don't you?" And the vision of the Traitor's Gate opened in front of me. And I said, "Ma'am, there's no answer to that question apart from something that is either on the one hand treasonous, encompassing the death of the monarch, or contrary to Section 1 of the Treason Act, or alternatively simply sounds obsequious." But that in many ways sums up why I'm sure that our loyal address today is something that will be so sincerely and deeply felt. It is because in Her Majesty we have found someone who carries lightly her own importance, a genuine humility is there, while knowing fully what her role is in church and state. Until the last opening of Synod, during a brief break in the COVID pandemic, she had opened the Synod herself in person on every occasion since it started in 1970. Many of you will remember that. And on each occasion, she has left us with a memory and a thought of someone whose personal Christian faith is undoubted, whose conviction as to the role and place of the Church of England in the realm is beyond question. In 2012, at her Diamond Jubilee, she came to Lambeth Palace and gave a speech in which she reminded the Church of England of its development over the course of her extraordinary reign. And I'm sure Stephen has experienced this when we're consecrating bishops and the mandate is read out. And whoever's reading the mandate, presumably Louise Conacher in the northern province and Darren in the southern, when they get to the end, given under our hand this whatever day it is of the year of this year, and in the 71st year of our reign, there's a collective intake of breath across the country. But that was only the 60th year of her reign. And she reminded those there that the Church of England is essentially the church for England, for every single person in England. She reminded us that we are there to defend the right of faith, to be the people of Christ, and yet generous in our hospitality. She showed in her speaking that profound sense of the hospitality of God, and I consciously, or the hospitality of the triune God, and I deliberately refer indirectly to the icon. And yet at the same time, and there is no contrast between these, she has been rightly described as England's greatest evangelist. Her Christmas messages are absolutely what one might, to coin a phrase, call Christ-centered. Maybe that's where the Archbishop of York got the idea from. And Jesus-focused. When we meet, the conversation is not just about the functionality of the church, but the faithfulness of God. She is a servant of Jesus Christ first. At her coronation, all those years ago, she came up the aisle of Westminster Abbey, straight past the throne, and knelt at the high altar for silent prayer. And that is a reminder that our Constitution is the Queen gives her allegiance, the monarch gives their allegiance to God before anyone gives their allegiance to the monarch. We are a nation under God. But that is not interpreted triumphalistically by Her Majesty, but is interpreted generously by Her Majesty, hospitably, openly, gladly. Over 70 years, she has adapted in ways that are extraordinary to an entirely different world. At her coronation, which lasted over 4 hours, there were all the hereditary peers from the House of Lords, no life peers. She has adapted to the changes in culture. She has gone on journeying with God through all these years in faithfulness, in loyalty, in devotion, and in trust. When her dearly loved husband of 73 years died, and I remember sitting in St. George's Chapel, my seat pointing so that I could see her. She sat in perfect stillness, perfectly alone. Her duty, meaning that no one sat with her, that is her service, her humility, her respect for all that is good and beautiful and holy. She cared for others at that service more than for herself. Perhaps apart from her father, the openness of faith, the dedication of life, the gift of service, the understanding of what it is to be Christ-centered and what it is to live that out to all in the land and all round the world is why when the Duke of Edinburgh died, the WhatsApp for the primates of the Anglican Communion was instantly filled with messages of condolence from around the world, heartfelt signs of sorrow, out of love for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, head of the Commonwealth. Because she is not only our ruler, the one to whom all bishops swear allegiance, she is also a world, perhaps the preeminent world leader in terms of moral influence, an influence that comes not just from her position in the realm, not even from her long service, but from the Christ-centered character for which we now send a loyal address, which I now move.
This item is now open for contributions. There will be an initial speech limit of 5 minutes. I call on Alison Coulter, Vice Chair of the House of Laity. You have up to 5 minutes.
Good morning. Good morning. Alison Coulter, Winchester 428. What an immense privilege to be able to add my thanks and express my admiration for Her Majesty the Queen on this occasion of her Platinum Jubilee. There have rightly been many national and international tributes in the past months speaking of Her Majesty's exemplary leadership, her faithfulness to her vow of commitment throughout her life, and her selflessness and service not only to our nation, but to the whole world. As Vice Chair of the House of Laity, it is an inspiration and encouragement to me that the head of the Church of England is a lay woman. And I want to take this opportunity particularly to speak about her example to us as she lives out her Christian faith every day in her life and work. How she lives out her faith is both an encouragement and a challenge to me, and I want to reflect on some of the things that I notice and celebrate and want to learn from. As Archbishop Justin has already explained, Her Majesty takes the opportunity in her Christmas addresses to the nation to speak of her own personal faith and hope in Jesus Christ. And she does this by sharing in a natural and straightforward way what her faith means for her in the context of her family and work. But she doesn't just talk about her faith, she demonstrates this faith clearly in her life of exceptional Christian service. Even at the age of 96, she is working hard for the benefit of others and is committed to and concerned for all of us, her subjects, rather than herself. She has particular concern for those who suffer or who are in need and is generous and hospitable to all, those who share her faith, those of other faiths and those of no faith. Her Majesty is celebrated as arguably the greatest leader in the world today, and yet, has already been said, she is humble. As well as taking her responsibilities very seriously, she manages to maintain her sense of humour and not take herself too seriously. I love the films with Paddington Bear and James Bond. And I love the story too I've heard about some tourists in Scotland who met a lady with a headscarf walking her dogs. She said hello and they stopped for a brief chat, admiring the beautiful countryside and the nearby castle of Balmoral. The tourist then asked if she had ever met the Queen. And the lady said no, that she hadn't ever met the Queen, but pointing to her bodyguard nearby said, but he has. She demonstrates how a life built on the rock of faith can give strength and hope even in the darkest times. Her dignity at the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh spoke powerfully of her belief in the Christian hope of eternal life. She resources this faith by a lifelong habit of public worship and private prayer, everyday practices of faith and formation which have shaped her to be able to live out her Christian beliefs and to be a living witness to the good news of Jesus Christ, even with the many pressures of being the monarch. God has indeed answered our prayers to save our gracious Queen and live long our noble Queen. I give thanks today to God for Her Majesty's remarkable Christian life, and I give heartfelt thanks to Her Majesty for her example to each of us of a deep Christian faith lived out in worship to God and in service to others. Synod, God save the Queen.
Luke Miller, followed by the gentleman who is standing at the back. You have up to 5 minutes.
Luke Miller, 163 London. In speaking now to support the sending of the loyal address to Her Majesty the Queen on her Platinum Jubilee, I speak with the support of the Prolocutor of the Lower House of the Convocation of York. Monarchy gives us a rule which is above the fray, given to us, and not dependent on the ability of the monarch to win an election, maintain popularity, or sustain the approbation of others. Intrinsic to this is the fact that the loyalty of the subject is to something higher than to the individual, and for that reason is offered to both good and bad rulers. And at least incumbent clergy have an affinity with this. For us as well, though our orders are a character conferred at ordination rather than something hereditary, though for some of us who are the children of the clergy and possibly have others, there's a slight hereditary tinge to our life in the Church of England. But for us as well, the unworthiness of the minister hindereth not the sacrament. But in Her Majesty the Queen, we have the happy coincidence of a minister of sovereignty who publicly and faithfully stands by a commitment of service which we honour in her. Our positive response to her springs from our recognition of the great Christian paradox that it is in the giving away of the self to others that we receive ourselves back and our own personality forms and grows. Not like the personality cult of the dictator, whose self-proclamation serves only to emphasize human vanity, but that self-emptying, which is most perfectly seen in our Lord Jesus Christ, and best done, as Her Majesty the Queen does, in explicit imitation of him. That self-emptying which raises others and contributes to his kingdom in the very act of sustaining our own. And this again is the model at our best for the clergy in our attempt to serve our Lord, as it is indeed for all the baptized called to serve or to lead or to be in any field. In stepping forward, we will find ourselves most perfectly fulfilled when most focused on Christ. We are privileged in our time to see this being, under grace, attempted very much in public, very obviously and very prominently in the service of Her Majesty the Queen to her people and to her Lord. The clergy of England are blessed in so many ways, and this blessing is perhaps great among them, that we in our day are Elizabethans.
You might be surprised to know I wasn't here in 1970 for her first address to the Synod, but I absolutely loved the Jubilee celebrations this year. I wouldn't have normally considered myself particularly patriotic, but the joy of the community coming together to celebrate our Queen was something quite special for me, and something I hadn't really seen much before, maybe since 10 years ago. But it wasn't really something I'd celebrated then. The opportunity to go to street parties and celebrate our Queen, to get to know our communities, I felt like we could do with more street parties. Our Queen, as we've heard, loves God and serves him above all else. In fact, in Deuteronomy 17, isn't that what we see regarding the laws concerning Israel's monarchs? Someone who doesn't accrue horses or spouses, someone who's humble, who serves God, who loves God's word. The Queen at her coronation was given a Bible and told, these are the lively oracles of God. Here is wisdom, the most valuable thing that this world affords. We have been so blessed to have a Queen that serves God, that we are a nation under God, as our Archbishop said. We live in a time when the nations rage. We read about this in Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage? The peoples plot in vain. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Do we see that in the world today? The world's tearing itself apart. How it's something we've taken for granted, isn't it? Having a monarch who loves and serves God, who is, Psalm 2 verse 10, wise. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. For we have a Queen who served the Lord with fear and who has rejoiced with trembling. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. May we listen to our Queen, our servant Queen, and the King she serves. Find peace in him, and may his gospel go forth. Long live the Queen.
Thank you. The gentleman with the very generous beard and another gentleman there.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do hope to be as generous. Thank you for calling me. Timothy Edwards, 200 Rochester. This is my maiden speech. The Archbishop rightly referred to Her Majesty as our nation's greatest evangelist. I'm sure that I'm not the only member of the clergy who, on the Sunday of the Jubilee celebrations, gave my pulpit over to her, as almost the entirety of my sermon was devoted to quotations from her Christmas addresses and other occasions. I was especially struck by how frequently she has quoted herself Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 45. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. I'm struck by her example and how we can follow that, and by following that as simpler, humbler and bolder. Bolder in the true profession of the gospel, humbler in submitting to our King, the Lord Jesus, and simpler in simple trust of him. God save the Queen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Thompson, London 166. Many of us will have been aware that there was a particular member of our synod who wished to bring a debate about flags to this synod, which reminded me of Father Conrad Noel, a well-known Anglo-Catholic socialist of his generation, who also put flags into his church while he was the vicar of Thaxted in Essex. He put in the red flag and also the flag of Sinn Féin. Eventually, the case went to a consistory court, and of course he had to remove them. And I speak also as a socialist and also as a Republican, and a convinced Republican, and as an Irishman who holds an Irish passport. And while I take my oath of loyalty to the Queen, as all of us are called to do, as those ordained into this church, I think in some of the speeches that we have, there is a confusion of loyalty to the Crown with loyalty to a particular person and also loyalty to Christ. I mean, I thank Justin Welby for all that he said about the Queen and Alison Coulter, and none of that I could contradict. But monarchy is not itself a given in the scriptural traditions, and indeed, if we look at the first and second books of Samuel, we have a very interesting critique of monarchy. And the monarchy that we have, of course, is also the monarchy that was part of the colonialist and imperialist past, from which many in our own societies still suffer. The reality of being faithful to Christ is about making sure that we are faithful to Christ's reign, which is a coming jubilee for all people. So whilst particular things have been said about Her Majesty's character, there are other things which could easily be said about the Crown. The wealth of the Crown and the wealth that the Crown holds is deeply contrary to the teaching of Jesus Christ and to the concepts of Jubilee and Sabbath in the Scriptures. We also see that in particular ways in which particular members of the royal family act, without critique from those who are in power within our own church. The heir to the throne receiving money in plastic bags from other monarchs. Issues around sexual mispropriety of other members of the royal family and the ways in which young women are exploited for sex. So I do accept this loyal address, but I also wish it to be noted that many in this chamber are of similar sympathies to myself. They may not be Republican in the same way that I'm Republican and wish for a republic, but there are those in this chamber who would wish that those in authority in the church could be more critical of actions of the monarchy which are contrary to Christ's reign.
I see two people standing, and I think these will probably be my last two calls. I'm going to go to a speech limit of 3 minutes. The gentleman here, followed by Bishop. Thank you. Up to 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Simon Eyre, Chichester 287. One of the events of this year that's probably spoken most to my heart was the memorial service to Prince Philip. As the Queen walked in with Prince Andrew, that drew much variable response. But for me, that was very, very poignant. For me, that spoke of three things. It spoke of forgiveness, it spoke of grace, and it spoke of restoration. Those are three things that this country needs so much. And for me, that was just a very, very practical way, some would say an erroneous way, to attempt to demonstrate that. And I'm so grateful for that demonstration. I want to say publicly how grateful I am to have lived all my life through her reign. She's been an amazing example to us all through that time, and I'm very grateful. Thank you, Your Majesty.
Many years ago, I was chaplain to the then Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harries. And one day we went off to Milton Keynes, which is in Oxford Diocese, to dedicate the new Christ the Cornerstone, the cathedral as it was almost called, the centre of Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes, a very ecumenical new town, and Her Majesty the Queen came for that occasion. As you often are as a chaplain, you're very well placed to see what's going on. And the Queen was there. In front of her, about 10 feet away, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, the head of the Free Churches, and so on and so on. Every key ecumenical leader was there, and very proud to be so. Finally, we came to sing God Save the Queen. They proudly stood to attention, singing right in front of Her Majesty, until came to the second verse. They realised they'd put, of course, their order of service behind them. Her face never cracked. There was a slight twitch, but they kind of thought they could remember the words, and roughly mouthing along with the rest of the congregation, more or less got away with it, until the third verse struck up. Can you imagine yourself in that position? There was a definite twitching from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then he thought, no, she's my supreme go, I cannot do this. I've just got to stand and sort of open and close my mouth. Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster did make a grab for his order of service, but there was a stern look from Her Majesty, and he turned back. The head of the Free Churches of the United Kingdom just basically stood open-mouthed. It was a moment of deep humility for all. Probably the closest we've ever got in the United Kingdom to full ecumenical, visible unity. God save the Queen.
I see no one else standing, so I call on the Archbishop to reply. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I was tempted to suggest we all stood and sang 3 verses of God Save the Queen. But as I can't find the lyrics, I think we'll skip that. But thank you for those comments, and thank you to Robert Thompson for the importance of hearing from a different view, and from an Irish view. My Chief of Staff, David Porter, is, of course, holder of an Irish passport, and would not be ashamed to say he was a Republican, though he says he's sort of put that in abeyance for the time being. But on one of my trips to Ireland, I had the privilege of meeting senior members of the Irish government and members of Sinn Féin, who had been involved in the Troubles at different meetings, as it happens. And both of them spoke of the extraordinary impact of the Queen's visit to Ireland a few years back for the 100th anniversary of the Easter Uprising, in which everything she did, they spoke of with awe and gratitude. One of her greatest gifts is that of reconciliation. She wore the right colour, Irish green, consciously. She spoke Irish at the beginning of her speech at the state dinner, which led Mary McAleish, who was to answer her, to turn to the person next to her and just go, who happened to be one of the people I was with, and just go, wow. It was a gift of extraordinary profundity, given that her own family had lost lives in the Troubles. And from it came not anger or even mere correct politeness, but profound reconciliation. We have the benefit not just of an extraordinary person, but we have the benefit of someone who would genuinely defend to the death the right of people in this chamber and the others who are Republicans and to speak in such a way. There are so many countries where that is not the case. We know that should this country ever change its mind about a monarchy, which I hope it does not, I have to say, but should it ever, that there would be no clinging to office, but a generous acceptance of the democratic will. We cannot say that even about known places of democracy in our world. Let us, with thanks to God, vote for this address, not because we're monarchist or Republican, but because in Her Majesty we see the grace of God poured out on this country. I beg to move.
We now come to vote, and we will vote with a show of hands. Those of you on Zoom with your green ticks. So those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against? This is clearly carried. Thank you very much. This item is now closed. We move to the next item.
Synod, we now return to the proposed changes to the standing orders relating to the membership of the See of Canterbury Crown Nominations Commission. Members should refer to the second notice paper as revised for the text of items 51 to 56. These motions for the amendment of the standing orders give effect to the decisions the Synod took on Saturday about the composition of the Crown Nominations Commission for the See of Canterbury and the suffragan See of Dover. As no member has given notice of any amendment or of a wish to speak against a specific item, I give my permission for motions 51 to 56 to be moved en bloc. I suspect that might be relief to everyone. I call Dr. Jamie Harrison to move items 51 to 56. He has up to 10 minutes.
Jamie Harrison, Durham, 301. Thank you, Madam Chair and Synod. Welcome back to Groundhog Day. We're back in Canterbury CNC. I hope you've appreciated the way that this process has been conducted. In other words, having a really good, open and helpful debate on Saturday to deal with the principles, so that we come today to look at the outworking of those principles in the standing orders. You will have seen the 60th report of the Standing Orders Committee, GS 2276, which pretty much covers verbatim, in the same words as we're going to be using, all but the issues raised by the 2 successful amendments. So if you want to see the whole text, you'll need to find on the app the notice paper section. You'll find the second notice paper revised near the top of the notice paper. So you may want to find that, because that will give you the wording of the 2 amendments as they are then converted, as it were, into the standing order changes, the amendments to the standing order. And as the Chair has helpfully received our hope, we're going to deal with these in one block, in one package. So we're not going to go through voting on each item. I'm asking you to vote for items 51 to 56 in one go, as one, if you like, one effective amendment. Just to pick up 1 or 2 things, and thank you again for your involvement and commitment on Saturday. I felt it was a very helpful and useful conversation, and through that we clarified what we wanted and perhaps what we didn't want at that stage. If we look at one question was raised in relation to the suffragan See of Dover, would there be confusion that that might be being put forward as a diocesan see? Would that be something that people felt was being put forward? Well, I think as you see from Standing Order 51 and Standing Order 54, it's very clear that the word suffragan appears, the suffragan bishopric of Dover. So I think that does at least make a good signal of what we're doing. It's not to confuse it with being a diocesan see. And as I say, all those early elements were received by the Synod unamended, so we only have to look really at the very end of the Standing Order 139. If you've got that on the app, you'll see 2 additions of little c and little d in Standing Order 139 at 2a. But I'll read them out for those of you who may not be able to access the app. So after a and b, we add at c. This is in relation to the 5 members coming onto the CNC in total from the Anglican Communion. So quotes with at least 2 of those chosen to be male and at least 2 to be female. This, if you like, clarifies the very helpful amendment from Nick Tall, where he used particular words that would have to apply whether we had 3 people or 5 people. And we've been able to translate that with the wonderful help of Chris Packer, our legal wizard on these matters in the legal team, to give us the note that there will be at least 2 chosen to be male and 2 chosen to be female. That just clarifies the wording of the amendment. And then at little d, I'll read out the text again, relating to the 5 from the Anglican Communion, quotes, with a majority of those chosen to be persons whose ethnicity is commonly referred to as global majority heritage. Now that's a terminology that perhaps not everyone's familiar with, and certainly not across the Communion. And I've been given some very helpful advice by Gavin to say, can we maybe help the Communion if they need it to explain what we mean by that in a wide context. And I'm sure we will issue some guidance as much as is appropriate. But equally, the Joint Standing Committee of the Primates meeting out for the Anglican Communion and the Anglican Consultative Council will be smart enough, I'm sure, to work it out in practice. As I said before, we don't want to be too prescriptive in what we're telling a very important body to do, but it may be that we can help with that. So I think, Madam Chair, that's all I really want to say, just to thank the Synod for its patience and care in this matter. The standing orders are very much part of what we do. They say what's going to happen, God willing, whatever says that will be. And as I say, it's not really Groundhog Day, it's the end of the Groundhog Day, hopefully quite soon, but equally people may wish to speak and comment. So, Madam Chair, I move, if I can say, this amendment to be with the effect from 30th of July 2022, standing in my name.
Thank you. This is now open for debate. Andrew Atherton and, yes, sorry, I don't know your name. We will have, I think, a speech limit of 3 minutes from the outset because we have spent quite a lot of time debating this already.
Thank you. In that case, I'll be as swift as I can. It was very good, as Jamie said, on Saturday morning to debate some of these underlying implications of these new proposals, especially for our global relationships around the Anglican Communion. And you may remember that I and others appealed on that occasion for us not to bolster our own English primacy over the global communion. We weren't sufficiently persuasive. The mind of Synod has been made known, and therefore we must pass these amendments without a quibble. But as we move today from principle to practicality, might I offer two appeals about how these standing orders will be enacted. First, practicality. Since we're planning to involve 5 global delegates, let us guarantee that they will be fully and actively involved in the process from beginning to end. We don't want tokenism. We don't want global Anglicans simply filling seats. They must be active in these CNC deliberations. Every CNC, you'll remember, meets at least 3 times, on Zoom for the long listing, in person for the short listing, and in person again for the interviews. Sometimes more than 3 times if the clear decision can't be reached. We must guarantee that for all the in-person meetings, our global friends will be in the room where it happens. And now that's going to be practically difficult, of course, because those meetings are usually at least 6 weeks, sometimes 8 weeks apart. So our Anglican reps, perhaps from Bolivia, Zambia, Singapore, New Zealand, will need to fly to London for the first meeting, perhaps here to York, then fly home again, and 6 weeks later repeat the entire journey from the other side of the planet. It's no small undertaking. 1 or 2 English CNC members in recent times have zoomed in for the shortlisting meetings for convenience sake, but it would massively disadvantage our global friends if they're on Zoom and not physically in the room. So please let's guarantee that we will pull out all the stops to make that happen. Second practicality, we're asking the Standing Committee of the ACC to choose these 5 global reps, and I declare an interest as a member of the ACC. It's this wonderful microcosm of the Anglican family from every province in the world. Archbishop Justin as our president. Our last meeting was in Hong Kong. Our next will be in Ghana in February 2023, hosted by the province of West Africa. But the ACC Standing Committee is only 14 people. 5 of them primates, while on the ACC as a whole, it's a body of about 120. It would be very easy, according to these standing orders, for the Standing Committee to choose 5 CNC reps simply by looking around their own committee and appointing themselves to it. That would be in line with our standing orders. But I hope they will be counselled to consult the whole ACC when we meet in Ghana, perhaps even to use that as an opportunity to elect the 5 CNC reps. We need this process to be transparent and equitable for the good of the whole Anglican Communion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rebecca Chapman and May... I'm sorry, I can't remember what your surname is. I can remember your first name, and I'm not supposed to call people just by their first names, but you know who I mean. Thank you.
Rebecca Chapman, Southwark 414. Thank you, Chair. I'll try not to take too long about this, Southwark, but having tried to be called in the previous debate and failing, I feel very led by my conscience to speak, albeit briefly. Synod, I speak about my concerns on this motion because while it can provide one kind of response, for me, we have asked fundamentally the wrong question. The makeup of the Canterbury CNC is clearly intrinsically linked with the role of the Archbishop, both practically and symbolically. The consultation paper on this item itself said, the big picture is perhaps too big for us to address, and we have to start somewhere. Yes, this is a big issue, but we should start not at the end, but at the beginning. And for me, I wish this had started with a more blank piece of paper to allow for fresh ideas and creativity. For me, we should not be changing our fundamental ecclesiology, our understanding of what it means to be a bishop, an archbishop, and to be in communion, without putting in a bit more legwork first. I've worked for 2 very different Archbishops of Canterbury, and each of them has done the role very differently. And the next Archbishop and the one after that, their call and ministry will each doubtless look very different. I wonder what it says to the Anglican Communion and to our Church of England about process and indeed about discernment when we consider replacing 3 elected members with those who may be appointed. Is what you know more important than who you are? In our desire for this arguably minor, maybe not minor change, I fear we are missing huge steps of process. And process matters, Synod. For me, there is a point of principle here. one of saying, this might be right, but maybe the process used to get here wasn't, and process matters. Process matters when it comes to safeguarding. Process matters when it comes to our financial scrutiny. It matters when we come to HR and to elections, and process should matter here. For me, there's a temptation in our church at the moment to ask, how do I get this through, rather than what's the right thing to do. A temptation to attempt to circumnavigate process, for very laudable reasons, I'm sure, but process matters. On a personal level, I and many others know what it is to experience pain and damage when process isn't followed. Let's not risk that for our church and our communion. Synod, I'm fairly sure this motion will go through, given the mind of Synod that was declared, but if you believe we should ask the right question, rather than asking the question designed to get the right answer, please consider, if your conscience has moved you during any of what I've said, to consider voting against this motion, and use your voice to say that process does matter. Thank you.
After the next speaker, Luke Appleton. Thank you.
May Christie, Southwark 222. I want to think a little bit about the importance of listening, something that I've been thinking about particularly in the last week, and in fact, particularly on Sunday morning when my son Walker, who is 19 months old, joined us at the Minster for Eucharist. He found the snare drums in the sacristy during Sunday school, and listening was indeed very hard during that time. Let us listen better. Let us listen better and commit to asking questions about what the future of the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury is, and how we select him, or indeed one day her. I have to admit that I was genuinely disappointed at not being able to hear your thoughts on our amendment. I'm sure that this is just me being a newbie or spilt milk, but I was disappointed. And I think that it's ironic that we were procedurally stopped from listening to comments on an amendment, and I would have liked to have heard those who disagreed and those who agreed. I think it was ironic that we were prevented from hearing about a process of listening by a procedure that prevented that. But that's okay. I will recover. I want to urge us all to commit to asking questions about how God might be giving us, how God might be helping us to give support to our leadership and to listen to the Spirit's wisdom in our leaders in the future. I am actually of two minds on the proposal. I think I'll probably vote for it. In practice, I am thrilled about a more diverse CNC, and surely you should all be so thrilled at that. That is a good thing. But ask yourselves why we have made diversity requirements on the Anglican Communion brothers and sisters that will be on that committee, and we don't make the same on the rest, on the, what must that be, 12 rest that will be on the committee. And where are the voices of working class Brits on this committee? And where are the voices of the young, who might indeed have a lot in common with that average Anglican that we've all talked about quite a lot? And is now really the time to rush? And I do want to say, what about the question on the problem of secret ballots on the ABC CNC? So while I will be supporting this, I do hope that we will ask ourselves some of these larger questions in the future, and in the very, very near future, and perhaps listen to what the Spirit might be saying to the Church. Thank you very much, Chair.
Luke Atherton, whom I've already called, and then the Archbishop of York. Thank you.
Luke Appleton, 309. I will leave it to the Daily Telegraph to mull over what the definitions of male and female may be. But I think you will remember that there was a part of our original discussion to which I raised anxiety about. What I would say, however, is that we've had the discussions, we've had the debates, and this really is dotting I's and dotting T's with something that we as Synod have decided. So I would really urge everybody to support the motion and to vote in favour of it. Thank you.
And then the Archbishop of Canterbury. After that, I'm minded to... sorry, I beg your pardon, the Archbishop of York. We've heard a lot from the Archbishop of Canterbury this morning already. We'll have the Archbishop of York this time. And then I'll be minded to, well, if there are other people standing, I'll give it some thought, but we do need to keep a bit of an eye on the clock. There's still quite a lot of business to get through this morning.
Well, you managed that elevation without any process at all, so... and I do apologise if I misunderstood one of the previous speakers. So I do apologise if I got it wrong, but I thought I might have heard suggestions somehow that we might be circumventing process, because process really does matter, not just about this, but in all our affairs. It really does. And of course, sometimes we may get it wrong. There's much to learn. But I wonder whether I'm almost going to repeat a speech I made on Saturday, but I just think we do need to be clear that process has been followed here. And it's actually a process that began a long time ago, over 20 years ago, in a process of reflecting as a whole church and a whole communion on the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury in relation to the Church of England and in relation to the wider Anglican communion. That has affected the role that I now inhabit, and it will now go on to affect the way we grow as a worldwide Anglican communion, with a particular focus and responsibility for the Archbishop of Canterbury here in the life of our national church. What this is the last step on a long process, and we did indeed have robust conversation on Saturday, and there is still now a chance to vote this down. I really, really hope that doesn't happen, but it could happen. So I think we must be clear. We don't always like the process, but there is a process. Nor is it fair to say that it didn't start with a blank piece of paper, because it absolutely did. That wasn't here on Saturday morning. That was with the other partners with whom this long conversation has been taking place. So I believe this is the right thing to do. I believe we have gone about it in the right way. And certainly over the course of this group of sessions, there has been a chance for alternative views to be aired and heard and debated. But I now welcome the fact that I hope we are about to say that we will be inviting other voices from around the Anglican communion to help us discern under God whom the next Archbishop of Canterbury will be.
Thank you. I see no one else standing, and so I can call upon Jamie Harrison to respond to the debate, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Andrew Atherton very kindly warned me he was going to speak, and not to panic, and I didn't, about what he might say. Very gracious and helpful, Andrew, in actually pointing out some of the practical details we need to get right, issues around flights and Zoom and costs, and looking ahead and getting it well planned. People have got to be in the same room, haven't they, to make this sort of discernment, and we must get that right. I think he also volunteered himself to help the ACC to do this, given he's going to be there in Ghana. So it's over to you, Andrew, and we're depending on you. In relation to Bex Chapman, yes, I mean, in a sense, we can argue whether this is the right process, whether we did the right work, whether we are changing ecclesiology, but we are where we are. I think, as the Archbishop of York said, we have tried to follow due process. We've tried to consult. There has been some listening, which was May's point, I think, May Christie's point about were we really listening. And I'm very sorry, May, if you felt your amendment was not properly looked at or an amendment was in some way discarded. When we do these pieces of work, it can seem quite technical. We're bound by standing orders, we're bound by points of order and so on, and that is the nature of the Synod. And I think this is equivalent to legislation. It's not legislation the same way, but our standing orders are very significant. And I suppose inevitably we can be drawn into that sort of thinking, and I think you're wise to warn us about that and to ask us, are we really being discerning? Are we really listening to one another? And are we making the right decisions on the back of that? So thank you for that. And I'm glad we haven't got the drums. It would have been great fun to have the drums this morning, but I think we had the choir and they were very good too. So there you go. To Luke, thank you, Luke, for your comments. Luke Appleton, just reminders, we've made a decision, we need to implement it. And again, just to the end, to Archbishop of York, still the Archbishop of York, I gather, today, that, you know, we look forward to the future. but we don't know what the future will be or when it will be, but we think this will be a way of enabling us to do the right thing at the right time. So I do ask you, please, to support this amendment, items 51 to 56, and help us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I therefore... point of order.
Madam Chair, given the concerns about transparency of process, and I wonder if we might have a counted vote of the whole synod.
If 25 people indicate that they are happy for that to happen, then we can have a counted vote of the whole synod. If you stand in your places, and those on Zoom would indicate by the green tick. We have 25 people standing. There will therefore be a vote of the whole synod on items 51 to 56.
I'm about to ring the bell to warn members that a counted vote is about to take place. 2 minutes after it ceases, the counted vote will begin.
Read that. In 2 minutes, yeah. 51 to 56. I'll need my own, I think. This is a counted vote of the whole synod on items 51 to 56. Those present in York using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2, and those who wish to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period is now open and will close in 1 minute. The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
The results of the counted vote of the whole synod are as follows. For 254, against 46, recorded abstentions 25, and so the standing order amendments to the Canterbury Crown Nominations Commission are carried. Since they are carried, I now duly announce that the amendments to the standing orders will have effect from the 13th of July. That completes this business. Please do remain for the next item of business.
Good morning, Synod. We now move to item 34, the report of the Clergy Conduct Measure Implementation Group. Members will need GS 2277 for this item and also need notice paper 4, the financial memo, as this item has a financial impact. I invite the Bishop of Worcester to speak to item 34. Bishop, you have up to 10 minutes to do so.
Thank you, Chair. John Inch, 42. If you're wondering how I came to chair the CCM implementation group, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, it's because Tim Thornton, then Bishop at Lambeth, asked me if I'd join the bishops of Lincoln and Salisbury on the Lambeth group looking into reform of the CDM. Then all three of them retired. I'm the last man standing. It's as simple as that. Having had misgivings about the role, it turned out to be a real privilege. It's been both enjoyable and fascinating. I wish to record my heartfelt thanks to the implementation group. Its members have put a tremendous amount of work into these proposals. They've given their time and expertise freely and have produced what I hope you'll agree is a really good and comprehensive vision for the future of clergy discipline. We've been greatly assisted by a group of consulting members drawn from the legal profession and parish clergy who have brought their wisdom and critical eye to our deliberations, and I'm also grateful to them. It would be wrong to single out individuals, but I'd like to mention three. The first, Professor Joyce Hill, the Vice Chair, who took over the reins whilst I was on sabbatical earlier this year. Secondly, Peter Collier. As Synod may recall, Peter chaired a working party of the Ecclesiastical Law Society, which produced a comprehensive report on the CDM last year. Peter has taken the lead on our consultations, and I'm hugely grateful to him for his work in this area. And then finally, Edward Dobson, the officer who supported us throughout our work and has done a brilliant job. Members will see the list of consultees in Annex C of the report. In addition to those listed, a further consultation with survivors has taken place over the last month, and I'm very grateful to the National Safeguarding Team for their help in facilitating this. What you have before you is, of course, not a finished system. I want to emphasise that the remit of the group was to bring legislative proposals to Synod. There is much detail that's not provided here. That's not because we failed to consider it, but because it properly belongs in the next stage of the process. Why does the Church need discipline for clergy? I hope that's pretty clear, but ordained ministry is, of course, something for which we are accountable, ultimately to our Lord, and within our polity, we need a fair and accessible scheme for the regulation of conduct. But as Synod will appreciate, blindly applying secular employment models to the Church is problematic. The privilege of ordained ministry is governed not by contract, but by the biblical model of covenant. As it happens, I dislike the term professional applied to clergy. Professionals have clients. We don't. I believe we should be amateurs in the true sense of the word, but held to the highest possible standards of conduct. But clergy are not superhuman. They are, as is true of all God's people, both human and sinful, reliant upon the grace and love of God in Christ. The Church must respond by providing a system of discipline that is flexible, proportionate, and rooted in the pastoral. Whilst the critique of the CDM could be extensive, the principal failing of it as a piece of legislation lies in its inflexibility to respond to different levels of misconduct and complaint. In meeting our objective, the implementation group has sought to apply 4 fundamental principles. First, the process must provide for a proportionate and efficient way of dealing with a much wider range of grievances and misconduct. Secondly, the process must protect clergy from frivolous, malicious, and vexatious accusations. Thirdly, there must be swift access to justice for both those who've been wronged and those who face allegations. And fourthly, the rules of natural justice must permeate the system as a visible sign of fairness. Synod, I don't intend to take you through every detail of the proposals. I commend to you the flowchart on page 31, for those of you who prefer pictures to words, and that is a very useful visible aid. I will, however, highlight some areas of importance. First, whilst the group strongly reaffirms that the role of bishops is central to the administration of discipline, it's of the view that a change is required, and the proposed role will be to receive the complaint, support the parties, and implement the outcome. This, we hope, will minimise the possibility of conflict over the role of the bishop. Secondly, the proposals include a provision that clergy may be able to self-refer to the system. This won't be a requirement, but it's intended to encourage personal reflection and insight, as well as being a way of heading off the weaponising of complaints. Thirdly, the CDM operates to investigate and determine serious misconduct, but the vast majority of times, clergy fall short do not constitute serious misconduct. The proposals therefore separate out conduct into 3 categories. First, grievances, by which is meant a complaint about a minor matter that does not constitute misconduct. Second, misconduct, which is an allegation of wrongdoing that's unlikely to call into question the cleric's fitness to exercise public ministry. And third, serious misconduct, which is an allegation of wrongdoing which may call into question the respondent's fitness to exercise public ministry. As set out in the report, each of these tracks will have a different way of investigating and determining the conduct in question. Fourthly, the group is clear that for this system to work, it must be properly resourced and embedded in the early stages of discernment, training and ministry. Finally, the commitment made to ICSA to implement their proposals has been adhered to, including the reintroduction of the deposition from holy orders for the most serious of cases. Should you endorse these proposals, and I very much hope that you will, the work will begin to turn them into legislation. I stress again that what we're debating today is not the last word. The implementation group is acutely aware that there are those who will wish still to have input into the reform, and the legislative process that follows will provide for that. It will not have escaped your notice that the title of this report is Under Authority Revisited. It's exactly 30 years ago that the General Synod passed a motion to start the process of reforming the then system of clergy discipline. The result of that work, contained in the 1996 report Under Authority, became the CDM in 2003 and began to operate in 2006. We hope to be a bit more speedy than that. The time for change is overdue. In the novel Brideshead Revisited, there's a moment where Lady Marchmain reads a story to her adult children. She quotes from a Father Brown novel where the eponymous detective explains how he caught the thief, I quote, with an unseen hook and an invisible line, which is long enough to let him wander to the ends of the world and still to bring him back with a twitch upon the thread. This image of God's grace as an invisible and inescapable line has provided a benchmark for the implementation group's work. We have seen and heard how the CDM has fallen short, and the group is confident that these proposals will redress this. At their heart, they seek to entwine that invisible line of God's grace with a visible line of natural justice, so as to create a golden thread that runs through the system. Synod, I commend these proposals to you, and Chair, I beg to move the motion standing in my name.
Thank you. This item is now open for debate. I need to warn you that we've had many requests to speak, and quite a few of those are maiden speeches, so we'll be trying to work through some of them. The initial speech limit is 5 minutes, and I'm going to call Nicola Sullivan to make a maiden speech, and Catherine Hubbard also for a maiden speech.
Nicola Sullivan, Deans 58. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. I welcome and want to express my appreciation to the Bishop of Worcester, last man standing, and his group, recognising that this is a complex task with far-reaching implications for clergy and those who need to raise a matter of complaint or grievance. I've been alongside the clergy discipline measure as a bishop's chaplain, later as an archdeacon, and now as a dean. I've supported clergy through the process when they've been subjected to vexatious complaints. I've been a person with interest needing to raise a complaint, and I have been a respondent. It goes with the territory, sighed my lawyer when I settled the bill, goes with being a senior leader in the current climate. Archdeacon Alan Hawker, back in the early days of the then new CDM, a neighbouring archdeacon, was confident that this legislation would deliver speedy resolution, open within a context of natural justice. He predicted that after initial flurry in the use and the novelty of the new measure, it would soon settle down. He could not have foreseen the changes in culture on the many occasions when this blunt instrument has caused untold damage, mistrust, delay, caused conflict for a bishop as both pastor and judge, and as well has created great expense. We're grateful to the work that Sheldon has done for its work and contribution in this area. I welcome especially the distinction of a grievance for matters perhaps more of misjudgment or of a breakdown of relationship, which will not need legal support, but more effectively be referred to mediation early on in the process before battle lines are drawn. Clearly, serious misconduct does require a full process. Synod, please, like me, support the report and encourage the group to continue its vital work, because it does indeed show the invisible line of God's grace amidst natural justice and gives us a way forward to the next process, the next stage of process. Thank you, Chair.
Catherine Hubbard, followed by the Prolocutor.
Catherine Hubbard, Southall and Nottingham 422. Thank you for calling me Chair for my maiden speech. I'm glad of these proposed changes. However, my main concern about the current CDM and about anything that replaces it is that the respondent must also have adequate support themselves. There are times when the clergy person facing disciplinary procedures may need to access his or her bishop for the instructions and guidance that they would normally look to their bishop for. Let me explain what I mean with a real-life situation which I share with permission. A former colleague of mine was put through a CDM, and during the process, the complainant regularly turned up at services in church, interrupting them and heckling during the sermon. The complainant sent sexually explicit emails to members of the church and even tried to find the home address of one particular member. My colleague was at an absolute loss to know what he should do when the church was under such harassment from the complainant and desperately wanted guidance from the archdeacon or bishop. My colleague repeatedly attempted to get that guidance, but was told that because of the CDM process, neither the bishop nor the archdeacon were allowed to talk to him. He was without support from his bishop and archbishop for over 6 months. He was given a CDM pastor who was supportive and prayerful, but unfortunately he didn't have the experience or authority to help navigate this extremely stressful situation. The conclusion of the process was that the complaint was dismissed. The complainant appealed the dismissal, but the dismissal was upheld by the President of Tribunals. And after the process was over, the bishop was very apologetic to my colleague that he hadn't been able to offer the help during that time. But the impact of the situation was that some people left the church due to the stress of what they'd been through. And my colleague came very close to leaving ministry altogether. In order to protect both clergy and churches from being unable to get the help they need, we need to ensure that future disciplinary processes allow clergy in such a situation to receive the advice and the guidance they need from someone with suitable experience and authority from within their diocese. Thank you.
The Prolocutor, followed by Lynn Nichol for a maiden speech.
Thank you, Chair. Luke Miller, 163, London. I speak as, at the moment, the Chair of the House of Clergy, and I have the support of the Northern Prolocutor in what I'm about to say. In paragraph 6 of GS 2277, the working group has invited the convocations to consider revising the guidelines for the professional conduct of the clergy. Yes, we will. And while the convocations may need to act separately, we will begin this work as a House of Clergy. Paragraph 6 notes that the guidelines, along with Scripture, the canons and the ordinal, come together to establish standards of behaviour for the clergy. In fact, they are used by many registrars to consider and define what conduct unbecoming of a clerk in holy orders might be, and they are therefore coming to have a freight of import which is greater than they were designed originally to bear. This, at least, requires this work to be done. Separately but linked is the issue of what a cleric is and what form discipline should therefore take. Is a cleric an independent office holder, a life led and not a job done, as I always used to say to my curates, disciplined therefore under guidelines, the ordinal and Scripture? Or are we like employees with rights and duties for specific time off, parental leave, scope to keep our personal addresses and phone numbers private, whose discipline would look more like line management? Our experience is that we are neither and both. And this impacts on our relationships with one another, with bishops and archdeacons, with our church wardens and PCCs, and I think is the reason why we are more than a little in trouble over our well-being. The Bishop of Worcester spoke of us being, in the best sense, amateurs, working under covenant to the highest standards, and I agree. But I have been reluctantly dragging myself to the point of thinking that we should clarify things by becoming employees. But actually, in reflecting on this, I would like us to begin a conversation about something different, about something perhaps that could help us to have the best of both worlds. Do we need something that looks like, wrong phrase I know, a professional association? We have models for this in doctors and lawyers, police and others who are office holders but who need frameworks. Could such a body support us with accreditation, discipline processes and professional conduct, which would mean that bishops could indeed, as the previous speaker said, be pastors and clerics, be both independent and have healthy frameworks, expectations and support? We'd still need to be licensed or given permission to officiate by our bishops. We would still need holy order, but could we place accreditation and discipline somewhere else? It would, of course, be complicated, and we would need to talk to many people and many stakeholders, unions, clergy, bishops, the convocations and others. But a useful conversation, I think. I understand something like this was thought about over a decade ago. It seems to me that this is a conversation which is now timely. We will do the proximate work and get on with that, as asked for in GS 2277. But I think starting something wider, which would take more time, but lead us to a better place, could also be helpful.
Lynn Nichol, then Sean Kellogg, who's joining us on Zoom.
Lynn Nichol, Worcester 433. Thank you for calling me, and this will be my maiden speech. Members of Synod, I very much welcome this report, and I welcome it because, as raised in the previous debate, process matters. Process speaks to the internal context, so we, the people of the Church, know that people are treated fairly, and to the external context, that we are seen to have fair, clear and accountable processes. I'd like to suggest that fairness, transparency and timeliness are all vital in any approach to the process of discipline and conduct, but perhaps what is required even more is trust. Both the complainant and the respondent need to trust in the validity of the process and procedures to deal fairly with the issue in hand. And we as members of Synod and a wider Church need to be confident that we can put our trust in this new clergy conduct measure to enable to what are often seen as challenging issues to be examined in a proportionate manner that recognises and respects that both the complainant and the respondent are children of God and should be treated in a fair manner with access to appropriate support. It is evident from many reports that many clergy in particular have lost trust in the validity of the existing procedures. And the overwhelming stress of CDM cases extended over a long period of time has caused stress on the well-being of clergy and their immediate families. And in the context of minor misconduct or grievances, the stress for the individuals, never mind the disproportionate amount of time, complexity and no doubt cost associated with the current approach, creates a situation where we can no longer trust the approach that we have been taking. It seems to me the report from the Clergy Conduct Measure Implementation Group has clearly recognised the need for reform and addressed many areas of concern in the existing procedures. In particular, the distinction between grievance, minor and major misconduct. And importantly for me, the requirement to provide support for both respondent and complainant and a process for dealing with vexatious complaints. I have to admit I was a little unclear about some aspects of the new grievance procedure in terms of impartiality of the assessor, but the detail comes later. Building back trust in our Church's approach to conduct and discipline requires any procedure to demonstrate the hallmarks of procedural justice, a fair process, transparent in action, gives voice to all actors in the case, and is impartial in decision-making. And it appears to me that we have begun to move forward in all these areas, and we have a code in which we can begin to place our trust as members of Synod, and has the potential to rebuild the trust of the clergy in a fair process. And for these reasons, I will be supporting the motion and hope you can too. And in terms of due process, can I reassure Synod that although this report is presented by the Bishop of Worcester, and I am a member from Worcester, the Bishop of Worcester has not bought me a pint, or even more preferably a gin and tonic, to speak in favour of this report. Thank you.
Sean Kellogg on Zoom, followed by Peter Collier.
Sean Kellogg, 298 Derby. Oh, sorry, Sean Kellogg, 298 Derby. Chair, thank you for calling me. I also support this, and I am grateful that it has come to Synod, as I recognise the pain that the current CDM process is causing all involved. I just have one query. In GS 2277, item 6, stating on page 13, they define the various levels, the report defines the various levels of offence with some examples on page 14 and 15. Given that it will be some time before this deeply flawed CDM legislation is replaced, can the level of offence outlined in GS 2277 section 6 and the penalties for those offences outlined in 9.23 be taken into consideration until then, and bishops has to have a duty to offer support to the complainant, victim, survivor and the respondent as prescribed in 7.8 of the same document. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Collier, followed by a gentleman there.
Peter Collier, 456, Vicar General of York, a member of the Implementation Group, and also I chaired at the Ecclesiastical Law Society Working Party on the same subject. Thank you for calling me, Chair. Last July, your predecessors, having approved broad proposals to reform the CDM and to set up a group to take those proposals forward, then passed a following motion which urged the proposed Implementation Group to develop a system of initial assessment that distinguishes between 1, complaints not involving misconduct, 2, misconduct that is less than serious, and 3, serious misconduct, with only serious misconduct being subject to investigation by a national agency and a formal tribunal process. The group which I've been privileged to be a member of has delivered exactly that. And for the last 2 years, ever since beginning the work of the ELS Working Party, I've been in touch with as many interested parties as I possibly could to seek their views about what a fit-for-purpose clergy discipline process would look like. Those discussions with others continued when I oversaw the consultation process referred to in GS 2277. And it's now clear that amongst the many different groups of people who have an interest in this subject, there's overwhelming support for the current direction of travel and the overall shape of the scheme proposed in GS 2277. Dean Nicholas already referred to the Sheldon Hub, and Sheldon was instrumental in raising many of the concerns and gathering the evidence about the issues that needed to be addressed. And we should always be grateful to them for that costly work. Those of you who are familiar with the Hub will know how trenchant it has been over recent years in its criticisms of proposals about the reform of the CDM. What I've noticed since our report was published is the very low level of noise on the Hub. In one sense, that doesn't surprise me, as during the consultation process earlier this year, there was huge support for this direction of travel and the overall shape of the suggestions that were being put forward. There were a lot of suggestions, though, about the details that should flesh out that current broad shape, and I expect a number of those will be spoken to in this debate. There's much work to be done in filling in that detail once Synod has approved that final shape. But I'm encouraged that if the spirit and work that's driven us so far continues, and if we continue to engage with people as we develop the measure and the necessary associated rules and code of conduct, then I would expect that very soon we'll have a draft measure that will also commend itself to Synod. And hopefully we won't get too bogged down in our own processes, but move swiftly to bring it into effect. We're already moving more slowly than many had hoped for last July, when it was hoped we'd have been at this point last November or even in February. We've no Synod this next November. And I know that February will be very busy with LLF and other matters. But I do hope the Business Committee will be able to find space for a draft measure in February. However, even if slowly, we are surely getting there. Please support this motion.
Sean Doherty, followed by Amanda Robbie.
Thank you, Chair. Sean Doherty, Universities and TEIs 450. Adds my thanks to that of previous speakers for the implementation group and the Bishop of Worcester's work to bring us to this point. I'll certainly be supporting the motion enthusiastically, not least because it requests that we receive the draft legislation, and as Lynn Nichol commented, we will be able to kind of debate and look at the detail when we get to that stage. But if I might trail a detail that I think is going to be really important, it's in relation to the role of the assessors. If I could just read from 10.2 of the report. The lead assessor for each panel will be someone with extensive relevant decision-making experience. It may be that they also possess a legal background or qualification, although the group do not regard this as a prerequisite. That seems to me to be quite an area that we will need to look at very carefully, Synod. Of course, there may well be people with extensive HR experience and other kind of relevant qualifications, but clearly the assessors are going to have an absolutely central and vital role in this process, and so we will want to be really careful about exactly what kind of qualifications, requirements, training, and of course support those people will have. In particular, it seems to me that the suggestion that they may not necessarily need a legal background is something that we should probe very carefully and possibly even change. Obviously, the detail of that is for another day, but something for us to think about in the meantime. Thank you.
Amanda Robbie, followed by Thomas Seville.
Amanda Robbie, Lichfield 339. This was meant to be my maiden speech, but actually I ended up speaking before, amending something. So let me speak to this, though. It's very important to me. Throughout 2019 and well into 2020, I held on to a verse in Psalm 37, like a drowning woman clutching a lifebelt. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. My husband had to answer a double CDM complaint that was being misinterpreted by those responsible for administering it, and the legal process was excruciating. We suffered from unjustified delays, misapplied rules, and this was compounded for my husband by his dyslexia. We were the lowest we had ever been as a couple in ministry, and our teenage children were also caught up in the pain. And so I clung to the Lord, trusting him, remembering our calling to that place, that land, and we continue to do good for our parish as far as we were able. But our pasture had been made unsafe by the failed clergy discipline measure, which, as we all know, has become a weaponised complaint system that punished us through its process without any finding of facts. And so I so very warmly welcome this draft clergy conduct measure, and I thank the implementation group from the bottom of my heart for their excellent work so far in bringing it to Synod and for the proposals they have made. As the measure is developed, I'd like to urge the implementation group to thoroughly consider the abuse of power from above, abuse of power from above by clergy can be matched by abuse from below. Clergy and their families can find themselves in a crushing grip between vexatious complainants or those with a disordered personality and the power of the bishop, and this has certainly been our experience. And so I want to urge the implementation group to bring a full definition of vexatious complaints and to thoroughly work out how to handle repetitious, vague, changing and prolonged campaigns. And I would like to see training for clergy and diocesan officers to raise awareness of personality disorders, which can so often be a factor in these vexatious complaints, as was mentioned in last night's PCC debate. I've got a couple more points. The first is about the use of registrars, and the second about support. I would urge that bishops should not be instructing diocesan registrars to conduct work under this measure, because most registrars have neither training nor experience required to handle these cases. So the use of registrars in any capacity, I would urge against that. And finally, has been mentioned a couple of times already, the support that is required for complainants and respondents. And so we were in respondent situation, and we really, really needed someone with a detailed understanding of the process. And I think this is going to be necessary again, that support needs to be practical, guiding people through the process as well as pastoral. So supporters, again, will need proper training. I'd like to urge Synod to support this motion wholeheartedly, and I'm praying that as this measure proceeds through the legislative process, we can ensure that pasture will be as safe as it can be for clergy and for laity, so that we can all continue to do good for the glory of God. Thank you for listening.
Father Thomas, followed by, I've forgotten your name, but just behind Neil, Joyce. Thank you.
Thomas Seville, Religious Communities 447. I'm very grateful to Bishop John and his fellow workers for this report and the improvement, serious improvements to the way the Church responds as pastor and as judge to complainants and to its other pastors. I may have misunderstood something, and I just said quite genuinely, I have perhaps misunderstood something, and I would like clarification or perhaps even further attention given to the area of which is specified in 4.5, where it is proposed, I quote, that the role of the bishop in discipline be modified. And the direction of travel is clearly a good one. It strengthens the pastoral role of the bishop, which I think is much needed, and I'm aware from many bishops the pain that they were caused by not being able to be pastors to people they really cared about. And that was a serious pain, one of the many defects of the old measure. And Bishop John has spoken about the importance of minimising the conflicts in the role of the bishop. I quote him. I think that's very important indeed. My puzzle is whether that has gone far enough or whether it has gone, or it's been made clear enough. There are three little rectangles below which specify the functions of the bishop, receiving the complaint, supporting the parties, and implementing the outcome. All well and good. My involvement in this business is largely listening to clergy who are either the objects of complaint or who know people who are objects of complaint. And the perspective from their point of view might well be different. Their description of these three boxes might look rather different. and I think even under the new measure, and especially the last one, implementing the outcome. And it's that conflict between a pastor, somebody who's looked for as somebody to listen and guide, and somebody who will be looked as imposing a penalty. That's perhaps unavoidable. I think it is probably unavoidable. It's not even necessarily in conflict. But how it's actually received does need, I think, quite strong attention. It may be some pastors have to go and yank the sheep or lamb who's about to tumble off the cliff. Those wonderful pastoral staffs, one of which Archbishop Stephen showed us the other day, are wonderful for catching things and dragging things, which is not very pleasant for the sheep, but rather good in the long run. I'm not convinced that this has been teased out as well as it might be, but the direction of travel is brilliant, and I hope we'll pass this without dissent. But thank you very much indeed.
Joyce Jones, followed by Bishop Martin.
Joyce Jones, Leeds 136. I just wanted to respond to something the Prolocutor said about clergy perhaps moving to be employees and the revision of the Guide for the Professional Conduct of Clergy. I just want to remind Synod that a lot of clergy, like myself, are self-supporting, and they too are subject to discipline, and also retired clergy are subject to discipline. So whatever support measures that there are for clergy need to include all of those as well. And also, I'd just like to say that the important thing about the whole thing is that whatever discipline is administered, it is administered with grace and justice to all parties.
Bishop Martin, followed by the gentleman in the pink shorts. That's you, yeah.
Martin Seeley, St Edmundsbury and Ipswich, number 35. First of all, I'm just hugely grateful to Bishop John and the work of the group for the immense progress that's been made, and strongly support this. I just wanted, just as Joyce has done, to pick up on Luke Miller's comments and to let Synod know of a piece of work that is being undertaken at the moment to look at the wider picture within which issues of discipline also fall, which are around our understanding of the role of clergy. This has been prompted and been on the agenda for Ministry Council and the Legislative Reform Committee, and some work began during the pandemic, and we're just about to pick this up again with a group to look at how do we understand the role of clergy in this current age. Certainly, as I look back when I started as a curate in Scunthorpe more than 40 years ago, there was a sort of instinctive understanding of what you were as an ordained person, and the culture around you instinctively understood what you were for and reinforced that. Now, much of that has broken down in the time that I've been ordained, certainly in terms of the wider culture. So this group is going to be looking at how do we understand that today? What does that mean in relation to, for example, as Joyce referred to, the guidelines for professional conduct of clergy? And indeed, is there a need eventually, and I'm in no hurry to do this, to revise the canons? But that's a chunky piece of work, but it's a piece of work within which these other considerations rightly fall. Thank you.
Andrew Corns, followed by the lady, sorry, I don't know your name, with the pink cardi.
Andrew Corns, Chichester 94. Thank you for recognising my pink shorts. I speak in support of the motion as a whole. It's vital not only to make the distinction between grievance misconduct and serious misconduct, but that the clergywoman or man should know this from the outset and should know what is the sort of penalty and also the most serious penalty that they might expect if their category of complaint is upheld. I walked alongside a number of clergy against whom a formal complaint has been made. In every case, it has proved traumatic. Wild ideas have raced through their head of public disgrace, loss of job, loss of home, having to pull their children out of school, financial disaster, and so on. Some I have walked with have considered leaving church ministry altogether. This is what the current system has done to clergy who, in the examples I know, are faithful and conscientious pastors of their flock, and where the complaints were, after some harrowing months, largely or completely thrown out. The annual report shows that that happens, being thrown out or largely thrown out, in over half of cases. This proposal will go a long way to obviating much of that trauma by making clear the level of seriousness, the speed of resolution, and the possible penalties. One aspect of the proposals especially concerns me. The bishop communicates both the initial complaint and the outcome and penalty only in writing. We sometimes call the bishop our Father in God. And the Epistle to the Hebrews says, "What son is there whom his father does not discipline?" Yes. But what father disciplines his son or daughter by sending them a written note? Surely, at beginning and end, the bishop should speak to their priest or deacon, ideally in person, or at least by Zoom, where the bishop can also read the body language, even though what the bishop has said will need to be confirmed in writing. With this proviso, I hope we will support this motion.
The lady here and then Jane Ozanne.
Michaela Suckling, 411 Sheffield, and this is my maiden speech and not one I expected to make. As a nurse, I am bound by a code of conduct, and I fully support this motion. I just have one concern. When we deal with safeguarding issues, which I have done as a forensic nurse in sexual violence and as a school nurse, the voice of the child or the voice of the survivor must be central to the decisions that we make. The Church is very clear that marriage is sacred, and I was concerned by some of the discussions around transparency and making serious misconduct public and in the public domain. And I wonder if we've seriously thought about the voice of the survivor in adultery cases. Does that really help them to restore their marriage and aid reconciliation? I really wonder if that is the case, because that is what we are hoping for as a forgiving church. I'm not sure if this is the relevant speech to make and in the right notion, but I do have concerns about that issue around transparency and sharing that on a website when people are trying to restore their marriage. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane Ozanne, followed by Sam McGuinness.
Ozanne, Oxford 380. Chair, this is not an easy speech to make. I very much welcome the proposals set out by the implementation group as someone who is a victim, survivor, claimant of clergy sexual abuse. I think we have a long way still to go in understanding the impact and the difficulties faced by women and indeed men as adults in sexual abuse cases. I very much welcome the removal of time limitation. For many of us, it takes years to come to terms with the abuse that we've suffered, to deal with the shame that we feel, to deal with the belief that we have brought the incident on ourselves. In my case, I should mention that many felt that that was the reason I was gay, that I had been raped, as I have talked about on Channel 4 by Clergy, and I've also suffered a sexual assault. And I would say it was actually because I was so naive and not reading the signals that I got myself into those situations. But it took me many years to find the courage to come forward. And indeed, it was only in 2017, with Harvey Weinstein's revelations and the Me Too movement, I felt it was incumbent on me to speak out, because if I felt too scared to speak out, what would it be like for those in situations where they had no voice with the media or friends to do so? So I picked up the phone and tried to talk to the safeguarding officer in the province of the clergy who had moved from England to somewhere else. And the voice met me and said, "Is it urgent? I'm about to go to the gym. Can I talk to you in a few hours' time?" I said, "Well, it's taken me 20 years to pick up the phone. I suppose I can wait an extra hour." We have a lot of way to go with training, I'm afraid, on dealing with these sort of abuses. I went to the police, and a horrendous year of waiting culminated in the decision that there was not sufficient evidence, which is the problem with the sexual assault that I had in a room not too far from this very building back in 2004. It was as I left my time on the Archbishop's Council, and it meant that I left feeling dirty, ashamed, and very angry with the church. So I put forward a CDM, and the first thing I needed to do was to ask for an extension. That meant that my version of events was sent to the perpetrator. Now, then followed a whole period, as many of you know, of months of us having to deal with this. But the difficulty, and the reason I'm standing today, is that everyone involved in that process knew both me and the person concerned. And yet I was not allowed to know who knew. And to this day, there are people here in this building who will know private things about me, but I am not allowed to know, as a claimant, who was involved, because the whole system is weighted to protecting the clergy person. So I do ask, Chair, that as you take your work forward, that you look to the level of transparency that is required to allow a victim and the clergy person to feel safe, particularly when they are people who are well known. Because women, particularly in parish situations, dare I say, refuse often to come forward because they know the wife, the spouse, they know the bishop, they know all the clergy involved. And the cost, as we've already heard, of going public and trying to have some form of justice is so high. They know that children may have to move school, that houses will be lost. I think we have a unique situation in this church when dealing with sexual abuse cases of adults. And I do hope that you will look at that separately and look at how best we can ensure that all parties are protected and yet justice is still done. Thank you.
Sam McGuinness, followed by Neil Patterson.
Sam McGuinness, Chelmsford 83. I just want to thank Bishop John and all the members of the implementation group for their work over the past year in developing these proposals. Speaking as the chair of SECA, we welcome these proposals, of course, having worked closely with Sheldon over the past few years campaigning for the replacement of the clergy discipline measure, and I again would encourage all members of Synod to pass this motion so that the draft legislation can now be prepared and the new framework brought in as quickly as possible. Members of Synod, we heard in the Canterbury CNC debates, all of them, that process is so important in embodying the culture that we want as the church, as the people of God in the world. But I just want, as we continue to develop this new framework for clergy complaints and discipline, to be aware that even as process embodies culture, also culture can be shaped by our processes for good and for ill. We heard Amanda Robbie earlier speaking about her and her husband's experience, and in the Church Times on Friday they led with the leader comment relating these new proposals to the tragic case of Father Alan Griffin, who was subjected, of course, to unsubstantiated claims built upon innuendo, hearsay and careless homophobic stereotypes, denied a proper right of response and not given any clear timetable as to resolution and rehabilitation, which of course sadly led to him taking his own life. And there are countless other cases like this that we have seen in the history of the CDM, which have highlighted the fact that even alongside the manifest failings of that measure, there is that all too human tendency to hide behind our processes, especially when dealing with difficult situations, challenging situations beyond our control, which may reflect upon us our own human brokenness and our inadequacy at being God's people and bringing Christ's reconciling love into the world. And as I say, with our clergy discipline processes, our current framework, we have seen our institutions, we have seen our church leaders hiding behind those processes, not intentionally, but still hiding behind them, which can only problematise and dehumanise these matters, when really we should be focusing upon reconciliation and bringing people back together in the love of Christ. So, overcoming that tendency, healing our culture, is a matter for prayer and humility and an institution. But to begin with, we have this opportunity to put the right processes in place to embody that culture and to encourage that culture that we want to be as a church. To be God's people and to embody those principles of independence, transparency and fairness, which will actually allow us to deal with clergy complaints and clergy misconduct in a way that brings true reconciliation and healing within our communities. So just to highlight again the main points of these new proposals, we have a triage system, a three-way triage, seeking to identify in a swift and responsive manner grievances, minor misconduct and the most serious misconduct, which will go to a central tribunal. As I've already mentioned, these will be dealt with speedily. Also, we welcome in particular an effective response to vexatious and malicious complaints, and we would call, of course, alongside the legal framework for that, adequate training for the new assessors, the new regional assessors, that they will be able to identify problematic behaviour and the sort of personality types that may lead to vexatious and malicious complaints. And then, of course, we call for real pastoral support, not only for clergy respondents, but also for complainants, to ensure that they feel truly listened to ensure that they feel that the principles of natural justice are applied in their cases, and that once complaints and misconducts have been resolved, that they can be once more rehabilitated into their church communities. And so, members of Synod, I would call on you to support this motion. Thank you.
Neil Patterson, followed by Mike Ireland.
Neil Patterson, Hereford 130. Thank you for calling me. I must take care not to overrun on this topic on which I wrote my thesis. I salute the hard and good work of the Working Party, although I have a slight concern about the supply of willing Mugginses willing to serve as independent advisers in the long term. But I'm mainly speaking of something of a global concern about the whole measure and the concept, a danger we have in dealing with this business in the church. It seems to me that division and conflict are inherent in the life of God's church until Christ returns. From the Acts of the Apostles onwards, we know that Christians have disagreed deeply in our imperfect understanding of God's truth. And we have had to find all through the centuries ways of holding those differences together, of which this synod, for all its frustrations, is in fact, I believe, one of the best. But the danger which I tracked in my study through 3 centuries is that we shall always be tempted to use every mechanism at our disposal, including disciplinary and conduct processes, to fight our very real battles. And as this measure goes forward to drafting, we must make a choice to guard against this. The naming of what is now proposed as a clergy conduct measure suggests an intention to do this, but there is little in the detail. We need to limit it to matters of conduct, and not those that are of controversy in the life of the church. I think I have time for 2 little examples. In a town parish in my diocese, I know there is a situation of conflict between a fairly new incumbent and the parishioners. He is leading the church in a new direction of which he is firmly convinced, and some of them do not disagree. I don't need to name the parish or the direction for you all to think of equivalent examples in your own experience. I've heard one of the key laity, someone with very senior professional career, say to me in conversation in another context, "Oh yes, we're going to see the bishop to get him to tell us how to sort out our vicar." That, I think, says something in itself. The other question is, what are the standards to which we look? The guidelines for the professional conduct of the clergy are very good. They can be improved by revision. But we have to be careful of the sources we look to. People will say, we look to the canons to tell us what we are to do. I think we know the canons speak of many eras, not all of them so recent. And to take perhaps a light-hearted example, the canons decreed, did they not, that all clergy should at all times dress to show their holy calling. I think that generally now means we should wear some sort of clerical collar. Behold, hundreds of clergy disobeying the canons in my very sight, even bishops. Unless, to think of the exception of the canons, you're all here for leisure or recreation. So, mindful that of our sources of authority are many and contested and capable of multiple interpretations, I look forward to seeing legislation arrive, which I will be keen to support, which defines clearly the scope of this new conduct measure so that it truly relates to matters where we can agree what is good and what is not in terms of practice and professional conduct, and not allow it to be turned into a tool, as has happened many times in the Church's history, for some of us to fight some others of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Ireland, followed by Penny Allen.
Mark Ireland, Archdeacon of Blackburn, number 69. Chair, I want to speak to paragraph 2.4.2 on page 7 on the duty to protect clergy from frivolous, malicious or vexatious accusations. Every time a bishop institutes a new priest in my archdeaconry, I'm then asked to induct the new priest and to defend them so inducted. That charge to defend the clergy so inducted is one I take very seriously. Bullying in any walk of life is unacceptable and should be doubly unacceptable in the body of Christ. But the current system is unfair because it is one-sided between priest and lay people. When a priest behaves in a bullying way, there are necessary processes in place. As an archdeacon, I've had to use these. And I'm hopeful that the proposals for the new clergy conduct measure will provide an improved procedure. However, sometimes clergy are the ones being bullied by lay officers. And tragically, the threat of taking out a CDM can be weaponized against a faithful priest who is trying to bring gospel life and change to a parish. sometimes by people who know that if a complaint mentions safeguarding is made against a priest, that letter, even if unsubstantiated, will remain on a priest's file for 70 years after their death. In those extreme cases where a priest is hounded out and leaves a parish broken and dejected, there is nothing a bishop can do under the church warden's measure or any other legislation to disqualify a bullying church warden from continuing to hold office. There was in the original church warden's measure, but that provision was struck out by the Ecclesiastical Committee of Parliament. The result is that that pattern of behaviour can then be repeated, and certain parishes get a reputation for repeated bullying and for breaking clergy. Such parishes become impossible to fill, and sadly, there are places that archdeacons are reluctant to encourage people to apply for. Members of Synod, this is wrong. It's a stain on the body of Christ and an impediment to the Church's mission. Whilst the conduct of lay officers is not part of the remit of this report, I believe that until this issue of the imbalance of accountability is addressed, clergy will struggle to have confidence in the reform of the clergy conduct and discipline process, whatever the merits of the proposals before us. I therefore give notice that, in consultation with others, I'm planning to put down a private member's motion on the bullying of clergy after this group of sessions. And I ask all members of Synod, lay and ordained, to consider that motion and consider supporting it with your signature, so that we can ask Archbishop's Council to work on legislative proposals to make sure that bullying behaviour isn't tolerated in the Church of Christ, whether it is by clergy or by lay people. Thank you.
Penny Allen, and then, Synod, I'm going to test your mind for closure of this debate. Penny.
Thank you for calling me. Penny Allen, Lichfield 335. I'd like to make a recommendation to the party investigating this clergy misconduct. I'd like you to look at the website for Teacher Regulation Agency, which gives extremely clear advice to members of my profession, former profession, who are involved in misconduct. The clarity of advice that's given on that website indicates both to the people who are complaining and to the complainant the process that's going to take place. It is a triage process for this. I'd like to reassure everyone here that in cases of serious misconduct, that teacher or member of staff is conducted away from the premises immediately. I'd like to assure everybody here that in dealing with vulnerable people all the time, which is part of our profession, and 30 of them in a room at one time, and having dealt with young people who've been involved in paedophile rings, young people who have been involved in sexual abuse, young people who have been stabbed, young people who have been burnt by cigarettes, that I know quite a lot about the way in which misconduct can take place across all communities. We are bound as a profession within our policies. We are bound by a code of conduct. We take that very seriously. I was very alarmed to hear about, in the pornography debate, about the level of abuse which is taking place if people are using unregulated things in the classroom. And I can assure you that if that is taken to the governing body or the head teacher, action will be taken. So I think we have been, and we always are, in a very vulnerable place in the classroom. And I think the things that bind us as a profession together are some things which may be useful within the clergy profession. We are in loco parentis in a classroom, which means we have the role of a parent. And in many instances, I feel the clergy are in those similar roles, and they have to discern for themselves how to operate within their own legal responsibility. But I do think, and I do feel for those who are suffering under this current CDM. Teachers also suffer when complaints are made. The difference for us is the decisions are made more swiftly, they are made with regulation already in place, they are made with support from our colleagues, they are made with head teachers' advice, they are made with union advice if necessary, and it gives a clear pathways for people. So I would encourage you, please, to look at that advice, and I feel for everyone who has spoken today. I think all our hearts are moved by the distress that's been caused by some of the complaints that have been made. Thank you.
Synod, I want to test your mind now. We've had a good hour of debate on this. All those in favour of closure of this debate, please show. Thank you. All those against? That's clearly carried. I therefore invite the Bishop of Worcester to respond to the debate, and Bishop, you have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much indeed to everyone who's spoken. I'm grateful for the tone of the debate and the welcome that's been offered to this vision. I'll whisk through a few responses, and if I run out of time, it may be that I won't get to yours. Thank you to Nicola Sullivan, a maiden speech. Things didn't work out as Canon Hawker had hoped because, as you rightly point out, of the immense change in culture that has happened in our society. Thank you to Catherine Hubbard for her maiden speech. In these proposals, you'll have noticed that the bishop will be under a statutory duty to provide support. That's really a very important part of the proposals. Thank you to Luke Miller. I'm delighted to know that the guidelines for the professional conduct of the clergy will be revisited as we've recommended. Speaking personally, I'd be really very sad if we were, as clergy, to become employees and work on the basis of contract rather than covenant, but others can argue about that. I'm thankful to Lynn Nichol for her important points about trust. I didn't offer a drink beforehand because I didn't know what she was going to say, but I'll willingly buy you one now, Lynn. Thank you to Sean Kellogg. The Code of Practice in the present CDM does put an obligation on bishops to offer pastoral support. It doesn't always happen, but I do hope all bishops will. Thank you again to Peter Collier and for the mention of Sheldon. We're grateful to all the catalysm that they've provided to these proposals. Thank you to Sean Doherty for pointing out the importance of having assessors who are properly qualified. That needs much teasing out. Maybe some of you here will be approached, so keep your heads down when the time comes. Amanda Robbie, a moving testimony, and I do very much hope and pray that what we're working on now will mean that such things don't happen again. And could I make clear that there will be a legal definition of vexatious complaint in the new legislation. Thank you to Father Thomas for your positive comments. Can I say that the idea is that the bishop should implement in the sense that the bishop simply tells the person in a pastoral manner what the outcome is, and that enables the role of pastor to be maintained. Thank you to Joyce Jones. Self-supporting ministry is clearly very, very important and included in our proposals. Thank you to Bishop Martin. I'm delighted about the work that's going on alongside this. Thank you to Andrew Corns. Perhaps you could tell us where you bought your pink shorts. They look rather good. I'm sure lots of us would like them. I do hope that the proposals we're working on will lessen the pain of which he talked. And can I make clear that the idea of people being informed in writing, that's simply so that there is a record. But of course, we would hope that the bishop at all times, because the bishop, he or she will be freed up, will want to speak personally to the person concerned. Thank you to Michaela Suckling. The voice of the child or survivor is clearly desperately important. Thank you for the bravery of your speech to Jane Ozanne. The time limitation removal is clearly essential, and it's one of the recommendations of ICSA. Thank you to Sam McGuinness. We're grateful for the welcome that Seeker have given these proposals. Thank you to Neil Patterson. I have to confess we didn't read your thesis in our work, but maybe sometime. I'm sure it was excellent. But important points about not using a disciplinary process to fight over issues of contention. But I'm pleased to be able to be clear that I am not here either for leisure or recreation. Thank you to Mark Ireland for those important archidiaconal points. And it's good to know that you're proposing something to look at conduct of the laity to work alongside our proposals. And thank you to Penny Allen. We looked at several other systems, not those for teachers, but it will be very possible. And indeed, I'm sure we will want to look at those as we go on. Thank you very much indeed, Chair. And Synod, I beg to move.
Thank you, Bishop. I now put item 34 to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. All those against, please show. It's very clearly carried. Thank you very much for that and for the debate. We now move to the next item of business, which is the announcement of election of central members of the Crown Nominations Commission.
Good morning, Synod. We come to the announcement of the elections of central members of the Crown Nominations Commission. I would just like to remind Synod that we will hold our applause until the end, so everyone's been announced. Thank you. I'd like to invite the Archbishop of Canterbury to announce results of the election in the Class of Clergy. Yes? Archbishop of York will announce the laity.
So these are the results of the election of central members of the Crown Nominations Commission for the House of Laity, and I'll read out each pair and the diocese from which they come. So the first pair to be elected is Christina Barron from the Diocese of Bath and Wells, paired with Vanessa Pinto from the Diocese of Leicester. The second pair elected is Debbie Buggs from the Diocese of London and paired with Prudence Daly from the Diocese of Oxford. The third pair elected is Temitope Tao from the Diocese of London and Clive Scowen from the Diocese of London.
From the House of Clergy, the first pair is Claire Lording from the Diocese of Worcester and Jo Stobart from Bath and Wells, Esther Pryor from Guildford, Liz Goddard from London, Paul Benfield from Blackburn, Andrew Corns from Chichester.
would Synod like to congratulate those members? We now come to item 35, farewells. I'd like to invite the Chair of the Business Committee to deliver a farewell to Dr. Jackie Phillips, Clerk to the Synod.
Robert Hammond, Chelmsford 273. Thank you, Chair. Dr. Jackie Phillips joined the NCIs in 2014 as Clerk to the Synod and Director of the Central Secretariat. Over her 8 years with us as Clerk to the Synod, she worked closely with my predecessor as Chair of the Business Committee, the Reverend Canon Sue Boys, to introduce and develop the Synod app, moving us away from paper to being a more sustainable electronic synod, delivering the first couple of remote and hybrid synods and managing all the complexities of that. She led the Synod support team and was a huge support to the work of all us on the Business Committee. Jackie has a flair for design and style and had a constant desire to increase the professionalism in our church. This is evidenced in a very physical change she introduced here in our Synod, this lovely professional white set that we're using here in York. And when I was elected Chair of the Business Committee, Jackie was brilliant at helping me understand what I'd let myself in for, selfless in her time for me, and also making sure I met the people that I needed to, but more importantly, supporting me as I settled into the role. But Jackie wasn't just Clerk to the Synod. She took a significant role in the heavy workload of the Archbishop's Council. She played an instrumental role in the Governance Reform Group. She was a champion for the improvement work of Archbishop's Council, effectiveness and culture. She took a lead role in safeguarding, taking over responsibility for safeguarding within the Central Secretariat when it had fewer than one full-time equivalent member of staff as recently as 2013. She identified this had to change and set up what is now the National Safeguarding Team. Jackie was a real champion for women in the National Church institutions, a friend and mentor to colleagues and to many Synod members. In thanking Jackie, who isn't with us today, for her time as Clerk to the Synod and her significant work for the National Church institutions and the National Church, we wish her all the very best for the next step in her career.
I'd now like to invite the Archbishop of Canterbury to deliver farewell for the Bishop of Birmingham.
Actually, I'm going to do Peterborough.
The Bishop of Peterborough.
We're going in reverse alphabetical order of diocese. If your name begins with W, you'd understand why. The Bishop Donald, who is online rather than physically present, is someone who is going to be remembered for his generous and kind and principled, humble and unassuming and personable character. He was someone who never stood on, he has been in his role, someone who's never stood on his own dignity, and his devotion to his family through many demands from illness and other challenges has been extraordinary. He is a man of wisdom expressed in profound faith. He's someone who lived out the opening words of the hymn Amazing Grace. He was someone who knew the grace of God and knew himself to need the grace of God, but knew himself to be loved, forgiven, and a child of God. In his ministry, he was someone who was deeply committed to relationships. Several diocesan officers have returned from networking events, having heard Peterborough described as the relational diocese. And certainly in my experience of a diocesan visit there, that was very clear indeed. It's how the teams, deaneries, structures are aimed to work together, but it took its cue from Bishop Donald. He knows his clergy well, he's an encourager, he trusts others to carry responsibility, and is clear in his public support. He was someone who laughed easily in his ministry, serious about getting things done and done well, but always in meetings encouraging laughter and a relaxed tone, taking time to work out how people were, not just what they were doing. He's a people person. His leadership was an outworking of his security in enabling the leadership of others, sharing the spotlight. I thought there were some slides around. Yes, I thought so. Let's just let them catch up a bit. I suppose they will. I'll just keep wittering gently on until they do. You won't notice the difference. He was a talent spotter. He might well say, unlike his main football team, but I'll come back to that at the end. He spotted talent in lay and ordained, and was great at building teams. Oh, it's appeared in front of me, thank goodness. Developing those who might otherwise be overlooked. He encouraged others into ministry, lay and ordained, and has made ministry amongst young people one of his priority. And his colleagues comment that they have enjoyed huge growth in the numbers training during the past decade. That is one, it seems to me, of the key examples of strength, and we praise God for that. So an example of a servant leader. But what mattered to him most was not his own position, but developing a missionary vocation at every level. The centre of the diocese is the parish church, was one of his early slogans. COVID, that great crisis, brought out the best in his relational leadership. He was always on top of the often changing advice, clear in his direction, and also clear about what should be decided locally. He wrote weekly to clergy, LLMs, and church wardens, even when there was nothing especially new to say, but simply to keep in touch. Excuse me. He displayed tremendous emotional intelligence in those letters, acknowledging the varied experience of COVID for people and parishes as they experienced it, and always containing gentle words of hope, lament, and encouragement. The diocese felt held together. Donald is, above all, a teacher and a preacher. Through COVID, he has prepared, preached, and posted a weekly sermon on the Gospel reading and another on the Psalms. They have been hugely appreciated to support teaching ministry across the diocese and by church members for personal devotion and learning. His preaching and teaching is highly accessible, yet we know that it comes from deep and learned and rigorous study, often from both the Greek and the Hebrew directly. Someone commented from one of the congregations in Peterborough, "He sounds just like one of us, but I've learned so much." He was one of those who sounded simple, but the more you thought about it, the deeper it was. The annual Bishop's Bible Day is a major event in the diocesan calendar, both at the pre-COVID gathering, with up to 600 people in 2 venues for Bible teaching and workshops, and during COVID. One of the clergy in the diocese remembers inviting Bishop Donald to preach, having just been invited by Bishop Donald to consider becoming Director of Ordinands. He asked a church member later that day what she thought of the bishop's sermon that morning. "It was great," was the answer. "It made me want to give up my job and go to work for him." The vicar became the DDO, and the church member became an ordinand. Bishop Donald is clearly focused on the local church, but like so many of the bishops, he has also cultivated wide interests. He's worked with ecumenical groups, the Council of Christian and Jews, developed close relationships with faith leaders across the city and diocese of Peterborough, champions the work of the leprosy mission in the area of mental health, and takes a lead in the work of prisons and prison chaplaincy. In the linked diocese, he's been linked to the Diocese of Seoul in South Korea, where, as well as some parish links, there's been good experience in lay ministry training. In schools, children with young people and families, there's been priority given, emphasised in a letter accompanying every parish profile. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from Chester in recognition of his outstanding contribution to Christian education. Peterborough is a trailblazer diocese for the Growing Faith Initiative, and the internship scheme provides the template for the now national Ministry Experience Scheme. He loves the Holy Land and has shared his love through leading pilgrimages, often life-changing experiences for those with him. He prepares his companions attentively. One of them said, on his most recent pilgrimage, he happened to mention that in the many pilgrimages, he had never yet witnessed a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Not 2 hours later, having safely disembarked from the Jesus boat in bright sunlight, the group experienced a storm out of nowhere, feeling every bit as powerful as the storm the disciples must have been through. Suffice to say, they reminded him that whereas Jesus had calmed the storm, he'd started one. He's willing to think differently. Tell me if I'm wrong. At some point in most meetings, this catchphrase will fall from Bishop Donald's lips. Sometimes it'll be the first sentence when he introduces an item where he is tossing an idea out of the clear blue sky. The joke is that whilst he's unafraid to be told if he's wrong, our exercise is that he isn't very often. That comes from one of those who work with him. On a different level, you could choose random subclauses of most of the canons of the Church, and Donald would seem to know not only which page it's printed on, but also the date it was last revised and the reason why. That will be a loss to us. Donald has paid real attention to the history and culture of Peterborough. He's developed a strong sense about what is best for Peterborough to grow. This has meant he's being willing to buck trends and to do things differently, and also inspire the missional imagination of others. He is going to be sadly missed, both from the House of Bishops and thus from this synod, but also from all his ministry in the Church of England. And we wish him a very warm future when he gets there in his, which won't be till next January, in his retirement in Scotland.
Thank you, Archbishop. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to invite the Archbishop of York to deliver a farewell for the Bishop of Blackburn.
Sisters and brothers, Stephen Cottrell, 002, York. Sisters and brothers, it's my really happy privilege to offer a heartfelt thank you to our dear brother in Christ, Julian Henderson, Bishop of Blackburn, who's here with us in the chamber. I first encountered Julian when I was new to Synod 12 years ago, and he was a very, very able chair of the business committee, steering this Synod through all kinds of issues with a cool head, a deft administrative touch, and a heart which was very evidently in the right place, wanting only to serve the church and to help it be better at witnessing to Jesus. Those same skills that made him such a good business committee chair have now been the foundation of so much joy, missional endeavour and creativity in the wonderful, wonderful Diocese of Blackburn, where he has served for nearly 10 years. Julian's journey to ministry began at Ridley Hall, Cambridge. He was a curate in London before moving further south to Chichester. He then served in Guildford Diocese for 20 years, where, notwithstanding the busy demands of parish life and duty as an archdeacon, Julian committed himself to a number of other roles: Mayor's Chaplain, Chair of the Penal Affairs Group and the Housing Advisory Committee, plus, wait for it, the Diocesan Advisor for Paranormal Inquiries. I don't think that's a typo, yeah. So, when writing a reference for Julian many years ago, an ecumenical colleague said this: "We have been waiting to hear where Julian might be called next, archdeacon or bishop." Well, it turned out it was both. And since 2013, when Julian became Bishop of Blackburn, he has worked tirelessly to shape the narrative and vision of the diocese in reaching people across Lancashire. And just recently, I was able to visit the diocese and experience at first hand the great work that is taking place. 3 things struck me in particular. First, an unwavering and joyful focus on evangelism and witness. Secondly, a high doctrine of mutual flourishing. Third, a bias for the poor. These are tremendous things, and it was tremendous for me to be alongside a diocese that was so clear in its gospel priorities. And this, for me, in those few days, culminated in a wonderful Saturday night evangelistic event at the gloriously seedy, beautiful Blackpool. I can't remember the name of the place. What was it, Jude? The Pleasure Beach. And it was simply wonderful. And in the 3 days I was there, I was praying on the streets, visiting the university in Lancaster, spending time with civic leaders in Burnley, and witnessing the renewal of the retreat centre at Whalley Abbey. Julian, dear brother, as the diocese looks forward to its centenary in 2026, I want you to know that we know that the time and energy that you've invested will continue to bear fruit. In fact, a recent diocesan consultation showed parishes overwhelmingly energised to continue in the work which you have led and embedded. Julian, you are respected by those who hold a diversity of theological views. You are at ease establishing good relationships with civic and other faith leaders. You have that particularly useful skill, empathy, whilst maintaining the correct level of objectivity. Your continued leadership and ministry with the Church of England Evangelical Council is hugely valued. You haven't been afraid to hold firmly to your views, but always with sensitivity and always listening to others. And I know that there are many clergy within the CEEC who've been so grateful for your pastoral care. And all of this with humour and kindness. Julian, you don't take yourself too seriously, but you do take the gospel of Jesus Christ very seriously indeed, and with confident joyfulness. Colleagues talk fondly that you regularly tease them with your observational insights. And although, unfortunately, I don't have photographic evidence, at least I don't think I do, I understand that during the Northern Bishops' Mission in 2016, you confidently waltzed your way across the dance floor at the Tower Ballroom in Blackpool. If anybody has the photographs, we need to see them. But you were also known for your integrity. When playing the familiar game, Two Truths and a Lie, you were, I am told, the worst competitor ever. And on one occasion, preaching at Sandringham, you confessed to Her Majesty your recent attendance on a speed awareness course. Despite being a self-identified southerner, Julian, you have been adopted by the North, not least your deep desire to champion the Northwest. And in your final speech in the House of Lords, you reminded the government of the importance of levelling up and how vital it is to bring equality and opportunity to the regions that we have served. In response, a fellow peer remarked, "The Lord Bishop of Blackburn is genuinely humble and totally determined. He really does live his faith." Synod, we say amen to that. Julian, throughout your ministry, you have had many supporters. However, and I do hope you'll pass on our best wishes, today we want to extend particular thanks to your wife Heather and to your 2 children. We want them to know how much we appreciate the love and support that they've given you and the good things that have happened because of that in making Christ known. Julian, as you leave the Red Rose County of Lancashire, I note your recent comment to the clergy you serve that whenever you leave a place as a priest or a bishop, a bit of your heart remains. So please, dear brother, go with our warmest, best wishes, our thanks and our prayers, and thank you for giving your heart to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the service of the Church of England in this land, we have no doubt of your continued faithfulness and that God will continue to use you in many ways to make Christ known. But at the end of this chapter, we simply say, dear brother, thank you and Godspeed.
I now invite the Archbishop of Canterbury to say a farewell to the Bishop of Birmingham.
Justin Welby, Canterbury 1. Justin Welby, Canterbury 1. I forgot to say it last time, so I thought I'd say it twice. The 9th Bishop of Birmingham. 16 years, now the longest serving bishop. Born and educated in Scotland, near Pitlochry, and later at Rugby School. I think he was captain of school and one of those sort of distinguished things, weren't you? Yes. And during a gap year in Uganda, he went working in, rather like me, I think with CMS or something. Yes, with CMS, same scheme as me. And like me, well, he was invited to preach, which I never was, for obvious reasons. And he tells the story of the interpreter who was interpreting for him, saying after about 10 minutes, to the congregation, this young man doesn't know what he's talking about, so I'm going to give the sermon. And which indeed was true, because David, as a result of his experience in Uganda, was one of those, like a number of us here, who owes his conversion, his finding of living faith in Jesus Christ, the East African revival, and to the life of Christians in that part of the world. He came back, went to university, and then joined BP, poor chap. And he served in commercial management in what was called the downstream area, that means flogging the stuff rather than producing it, in London and in Belfast, I think, where he was the sort of manager for that part of the world. But he left there and trained for ordination at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford before he was ordained as a deacon in 1984. He served his title parish, his curacy, and his years of ministry in parishes in Hull, and then to Coventry, where he became vicar of Holy Trinity Church, Coventry, and later an honorary canon at the cathedral, and where his friendship with both bishops under which he served was something that they appreciated exceptionally. And that's one of the first things I want to draw out about him, that David has an extraordinary gift for friendship. All over the place, you find people who have found him to be a faithful and long-standing friend. He is someone who gives himself to people and continues to do so and to keep in touch with them and pray with them. He became chair of trustees for CMS in 1994 and remained so in 2008. And it was during that period that he began to find an interest in China. He became Bishop of Birkenhead in 2000 and then Bishop of Birmingham in 2006. And on appointment to Birmingham in 2006, he is quoted as saying, "I want to stay in Birmingham until I retire." And this he has achieved. And in Birmingham, his work in the interfaith area and the ecumenical work has been absolutely extraordinary. He has transformed the diocese in many, many ways, but drawing together its leadership in a diocese that was historically, in a city that has historically been one of the most secular in the United Kingdom. He started with a challenging place for the church and has worked tirelessly and brilliantly there, both with the leaders of other faiths and ecumenically, and in reshaping the diocese for mission. In the last few years, since 2015, 7 years, he has been convener of the Lord's Spiritual. That means he tries to shepherd those bishops that are part of the House of Lords. He hasn't succeeded in that, but nor has anyone before, and nor will anyone in the future. He's been a member of the House of Lords since 2010 and has been someone, again, who has built up enormous friendships there with everyone from the doorkeepers and those behind the bars, especially with those behind the bars, almost exclusively with those behind. Did I say that aloud? I'll come back to that in a minute on when mentioning China again. Has shown his interest and understanding in foreign policy and his leadership on economy and business, as well as local and regional government. He has been president of the Friends of IPASC, which is a community health training program in DR Congo. He's a board member of Birmingham Hippodrome Theatre, council member of the Centre of Commerce, a church commissioner, and chair of Ridley Hall. He has also been and is for the church the main envoy to the international mining companies. And that has been work that has laid behind the work of the Transition Pathway Initiative, which has been extraordinarily effective and has resulted in several heads of mining companies looking very differently at Christian faith and being revived or drawn towards Christian faith. It has also had a huge impact on the major companies' attitude to their social responsibilities. And he's worked tirelessly with Archbishop Tabo in the Primate of Southern Africa on extraordinary work, which is having a transformative effect in a whole industry. I'm very glad that he will continue to do that in his retirement. He'll retire in October, which means he will be in post for the Commonwealth Games in August in Birmingham and will be part of the Welcome to Birmingham. The Commonwealth Games take obviously second place to the much more important event in Canterbury, which is absolutely, literally the same 2 weeks, which is called the Lambeth Conference. He will obviously be present at the Lambeth Conference for almost the whole time of that. Not. I can't think why he'd think it'd be more interesting. He went to walkabout in Birmingham in 2006, and he met a disabled athlete there, Mark Southern, aged 33, from Erdington, who said, "I reckon he'll change Birmingham a lot," and he has indeed done so. And he's going to relocate to London, where he will take up the role of assistant priest of St Mary at Hill, the church for Billingsgate. A couple of final stories. He is someone who, having done a lengthy trip with him in China, is absolutely tireless. He goes to bed very, very late. He has got up long before any of the rest of us and usually been running. And that is regardless of the events of the previous night. For example, when we went to China, we were beautifully received by the minister at the time. He's retired since then, for religious affairs. And we had a banquet. And at a banquet in China, as soon as they get the minister, relevant minister gets bored with talking to whoever the principal guest is, which in my case took him about a minute and a half, you start getting the toasts, and you have these small shot glasses of rather strong pale liquid, and they say kampai, which means bottom up, which means you have to drain the glass. And quickly, the rest of us learned that one of the most important techniques when saying kampai is the quick flick of the wrist. David didn't. He ended the evening in a sort of undeclared kampai, because then everyone moves around the table. You go from place to place going kampai. David did this with the best of us, except that he and the minister swapped to kampaiing jugs of this pale liquid quite early on in the dinner. Don't shake your head. I remember every moment of it, at least for the first half of dinner. The minister was last seen being helped out by two of his colleagues. He would no doubt claim he was helping them, but I'm not sure it looked like that, and subsequently retired. The only difference I noticed in David was that his Scots accent began to emerge slightly more strongly, and he was still up at 5 and running the following morning. He is tireless. A friend of mine whose children are his godchildren says that whenever they go on holiday together, David takes the children clubbing, and the children always come home before David. But the interesting thing is that all those children and his other godchildren, and those many others who have been lost sheep, come to know and love Jesus Christ. He is an evangelist of extraordinary skill, whose affection and friendships are genuine, whose sacrifice for others is continual. I am so glad that he will continue to do some work in the church, and I am so grateful, as we all should be, for his extraordinary ministry in Birmingham, his dedication, and the giving of his life in every moment and every way. David, thank you very much indeed.
We now move to the next item, prorogation.
In the name of God, Amen. We, Stephen Jeffrey, by divine providence, Archbishop of York, do now prorogue this synod to and until the 6th day of February 2023, subject to the powers exercisable by the presidents under the Constitution and the standing orders of the Synod. Dear friends, if you are able, please would you stand. Heavenly Father, guide by your Spirit the work and witness of your church in this land. We thank you for this time together, for all that we have discussed and decided, that it will bear fruit in more people coming to know Jesus as Lord and of your kingdom being established in our land. And now may the Lord go before you to guide you. May he stand behind you to give you strength. May his love watch over you to keep you always in his peace. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you always. Amen. Dear sisters and brothers, thank you for your participation in this synod. You are released. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. In the name of Christ. Amen.
Great.